Hey everybody, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we are exploring how to get the drum sound of Hard to Explain by The Strokes.
The drummer was Fab Moretti. The producer was Gordon Rafael. It is super weird sounding. It sounds like a drum machine, but it's real drums. We're gonna figure it out.
For our drums, we used a Ludwig Vistalite kick drum, a Catalina Maple Gretsch snare drum. To make everything as dead sounding as possible, we used two big fat snare drum donuts on the snare, and we put a clamp on our hi-hat, as well as having our friend Ben hold the hi-hat to make it as short sounding as possible. For our hi-hats, we used a 14-inch K-Sweet on the bottom, and on top, we used a lighter Istanbul Agop hi-hat cymbal.
So to capture the sound for Hard to Explain, you have to be completely reckless with your processing. This is not a situation where we're trying to capture the way that drums sound in a room. This is not a situation where we are trying to be in any way pure or right with the way that we're recording things, with the way that we are mixing things, right? This is purely to make a feeling happen. So the feeling that they were going for was making drums that sound like a drum machine, but are actually played by a live person, right? So that they can capture the feel, but have the kind of sterileness of a drum machine intact. If you listen to a drum machine, right? Drum machines are generally built up of some kind of synthesized materials. So it's usually some kind of tone generator that has a certain decay, and then usually some kind of white noise generator with a certain decay, and through that they can make something that sounds like a snare drum, through that they can make something that sounds like a hi-hat. It's generally heavily EQ'd, heavily processed feeling, and it is these really segmented things of the tone and the noise, right? In order to do that, we knew that we would need to process these drums really heavily. And to give us the leeway to do that, we wanted every drum as separate as it possibly could be. Now, the TikTok famous video of them explaining how they did this was they took all the drums, spread them out as physically far apart as they could possibly be, and through that, you just from the distance, you have a lot less bleed. Now, that alone is not enough to make this sound as segmented as a drum machine, right? Drum machines don't have any interaction between any of the different parts. So in order to do that, we had to heavily gate each drum, and that way we were able to process each one completely differently. All right, so the kick is the simplest processing on this. This is not a terribly different kick drum sound than a recorded kick drum. The only difference is that there is no room whatsoever in this. None of the other mics are picking up the kick drum. So we had to be really conscious of the length of the kick drum, right? We controlled that a little bit with the gate. We had to be really conscious of the tone of the kick drum because we knew that usually you get some of the tone and the depth out of the other microphones. We knew these were the only microphones that we could use to get it. We didn't use a kick in and kick out mic like you would normally use, right? Because we were using a kick drum with no front head. Instead, what we decided to do was put these mics exactly in the same place. The capsules were phase aligned, so they could be used together perfectly. However, one of them was an AKG D12, and one of them was a Neumann FET 47. The D12, it has way less low end, right? Because it is a dynamic microphone, it's just not gonna capture quite as much length, it's not gonna capture quite as much tone, but it has a really, really pronounced attack, and that's most of what we're gonna use that microphone for. Now, the other microphone, the FET 47, it had a ton of length, it had a ton of tone, it had a ton of low end, and blending them together, we got a really well-balanced sound. So this snare drum is heavily, heavily processed, right? It sounds kind of crazy on its own, and then you put all the processing on and it makes a lot of sense. The biggest thing that the processing is doing, we're adding distortion, right? The snare drum needed distortion. The reason that it needed distortion was because the snare drum, when it's going through a drum machine, the high end is something more like white noise. The high end is not this like super kind of natural snare sound. It is a very kind of burst of white noise sound. And in order to make a snare drum feel a little bit more like that, you add distortion. All of the high end, the more that you distort it, the more harmonics that get added. If you take a snare drum and you just kept distorting it and distorting it and distorting it, eventually you would end up with something that just sounded like white noise, essentially, right? The more harmonics that you add, the closer to white noise you get. So just putting a little bit of distortion on that snare drum, it added a feeling of kind of white noise burst, and that coupled with the gating on the snare makes that white noise sound really, really artificial and cool. It kind of makes it sound like a drum machine. The other thing that we had to do to make it feel like a drum machine was a drum machine, the fundamental frequency of that snare is really, really pronounced and specific. When you have a normal live snare drum, there's all kinds of overtones going on. There's all kinds of harmonics, and you're not just getting this like really distinct fundamental frequency, you're getting this big mashup of frequencies. In order to make a snare drum that is natural like that feel more like a drum machine, what we did is we started notching out certain frequencies. So certain overtones that were ringing, that were not the lowest fundamental frequency, we started finding really narrow EQs and we would subtract those frequencies. And what happens is as you subtract those frequencies, it starts to bring out the fundamental. Whatever frequency is left, that frequency comes out. And so you can get this kind of like almost like a sine wave sound, right? The way that like a 808 drum machine is put together, you can start to get something like that just out of EQing the snare drum in specific ways. Now, if you take that and you even add distortion to it, it adds a little bit of the harmonics back and you end up with this really, really focused, really drum machine-y type of sound. So for the hi-hat, we ended up using a 57 on this. The hi-hat did not have a ton of crazy, like crystal clear high end. It was very processed feeling. And so in order to achieve that, we went with a dynamic microphone that would kind of add mid-range to it in a cool way. Even from that, the hi-hat still felt pretty natural. It had a lot of attack. It had a decent amount of low end because we had to mic the hi-hat really, really close, like way closer than you would ever normally mic a hi-hat. That was just to make sure that we didn't have any snare bleed in it. We wanted to just be hi-hat. So in order to deal with that, we had to EQ it really heavily. We got rid of a ton of the low end, right? All these overtones and things, got rid of them. In order to make this sound more just like a burst of white noise, we also did some tape saturation stuff to it. We did a little bit of distortion with a few different plugins, but we also used the lo-fi plugin that just comes with Pro Tools. And when you turn up the saturation knob, it starts to mellow out all of the transients in a really aggressive way. Now, this is a plugin that like you don't need, you need a tiny bit. If you go to the lowest setting, it's already doing a little bit of something. So we had it just barely up, and as soon as it started taking away too much high end, we reeled it back, but through that, we were able to get this sound that feels very much like bursts of white noise and doesn't have a ton of the like attack that a hi-hat has, just has the kind of mellowed out white noise attack that a drum machine hi-hat would have. That was Hard to Explain by The Strokes.
Thanks for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to hear us break down. We'll see you next time.